Angular developers have been waiting for better RxJS integration for 7 years now. Instead, it looks like the Angular team is looking at alternatives to RxJS, a new reactive primitive that doesn't even have switch map. It just takes care of synchronizing state. This made me really angry at first, to be honest. But after a lot of thinking and talking with other developers, I have decided that actually this could end up being a really great decision for Angular. Not because it abandons RxJS. I still love RxJS, obviously. Like all my videos are about RxJS. So, but I'll explain why. First of all, why I was so angry when it looked like they were walking away from RxJS. But I'll also explain how my thinking has evolved over time and why now I think that actually this would be good even for developers who are, diehard RxJS fans. So for me, it started 5 or 6 years ago. I didn't even know about RxJS until Angular forced everyone to learn it for Angular. I basically just thought that they were promises, but a little better because instead of one value, they could return multiple values over time. So if you're using an API, maybe you do some, get request and then you do .subscribe and then you set, this dot data equals response or whatever. And so basically you treat it the same way as promises, but you get to also use it for things like WebSockets. So that'd be cool. Multiple values over time. That's perfect. But nifty things that are a little better than promises. That's what I thought they'd be. But actually it turned out to be different. There's something fundamentally different that observables enable that promises do not. And that is the ability to represent data sources, long-lived data sources, as permanent sources of data. And so asynchronous logic, like for the first time, you can represent it declaratively. And that is such a huge deal. Nobody knew how important this was at the beginning. Well, maybe some people did, but none of the Angular developers I knew had any idea how much this would change the way we think about writing apps with a lot of async logic. But it has changed everything. So it's because of functional reactive programming. Because this ability to represent data sources declaratively and asynchronous logic declaratively, you can use functional reactive programming to basically eliminate race conditions and inconsistent state, improve code organization, reduce page load time, and what was the last one? Simplify state management and make naming easier. These are the things that I went over in my last video. So if you doubt any of these things, you should go and watch the last one. Basically, it's really cool, and it makes data flow so much simpler, and it just improves code quality by a lot. So, but in order for you to be able to take advantage of this, you have to change your mindset a little bit. Instead of thinking imperatively, you have to have a mindset that's known as thinking reactively. So this was actually quite a big shift in mindset. And the first time most Angular developers encountered this was with NgRx Store. NgRx Store was created by Rob Wormold in 2016, I think, as the go-to state management library for Angular. React had Redux. What does Angular have? Angular just had services, but that's not very structured. It's not very orderly. So it seemed like Angular needed something a little more sophisticated for handling state. And so it seemed natural to bring over Redux because it was the most popular solution over in React. And the interface for it, the API for the Redux store was actually just like an observable. Actually, it even has a subscribe method. So it just looks like it's an observable waiting to be implemented as an observable. This sounds really cool until we started running into weird issues, features that we expected to be there that weren't. For example, how do you access the current state of the store with an Angular service? If you're just setting state in a service somewhere, you can just grab that state. You just access it. But with RxJS and mainly RxJS because this was NgRx, but it was fundamentally an observable. You're not supposed to just grab the current state for some reason. So like, why? Like, what does that even come from? Because this wasn't even like, it wasn't accidental. This was on purpose. There wasn't even a plan to implement or add this feature. It seemed like the fact that it's annoying is the point of it, which was really frustrating for a lot of people. It wasn't just getting state either. There's a lot of things about RxJS and observables that was pretty annoying, and they all seem to have a reason for them. So when you dive into it a little bit more, it turns out to be basically an RxJS thing where you're supposed to not unsubscribe. So if you search these problems like I did in 2017 when I was first doing Angular stuff with NgRx, I found articles called "Don't unsubscribe," and then another one called "Don't subscribe." I'm like, can you, like, this is so weird. These are observables, right? You subscribe. That's the point. That's how you get the data. How do you use observables if you're not allowed to access the data? So yeah, it's very different. Promises, like, can you imagine somebody saying, "Never, don't ever call .then on a promise"? It really is ridiculous. So there were other alternative method, like ways of getting data and combining it, like with latest from, take until for unsubscribing, and then the async pipe, the almighty async pipe in Angular. It seemed to be like just a totally different way of using data in Angular. So this was kind of like a fork in the road for Angular developers. Here we have this new philosophy, these new APIs, and you have a choice to make. Maybe there's something to this RxJS stuff. Maybe I should consider it and see what an app looks like according to these rules and see if I like it and see if there's some value there. Or, I could just, get angry and just say, RxJS sucks. I want to get the data, get out of here, observables. I'm just going to do the normal imperative programming I'm used to. So the community basically split at this point. Some Angular developers loved RxJS and ran with it. I was one of them. And a lot of others just really, really wished that it didn't exist in Angular apps. So pretty much immediately we started to see alternatives to NgRx, because NgRx was this sort of thing that forced us to use RxJS more than some Angular developers wanted to. So NgXS, it supports a lot of imperative styles. It's called, I don't see it here, but it's referred to often as progressive state management, meaning you don't have to manage state, I guess, or it's like progressively more heavy state management, something like that. And that's common. Like reactivity in RxJS is seen as heavier than imperative, even though it often actually isn't. But that's kind of the perspective that at least it's progressively moving from an imperative to a reactive mindset. So NgXS is basically NgRx, except you don't have to actually learn the reactive style of coding. And Akita was similar. I haven't used Akita nearly as much, but it got rid of some of the reactive data flow. Like in order to set state in the store, you have to specifically call a method on the class. And that's just imperative code. With Redux and NgRx, you can dispatch something and have multiple states react to it. So it's more reactive. And then for the developers who loved RxJS, we just kept using RxJS more and more. And I remember just getting more and more excited about it, about the future that was possible with full reactivity. I remember listening to an episode of Angular Error. I think it was back in 2017 or 2018. Rob Wormold was talking about the future of Angular. And one of the things basically the main vision that he painted, at least in my imagination, was a future where Angular apps didn't have, there wasn't really a point to change detection. Or I thought that zone and change detection were the same thing. So I know at least he said it was zoneless, but in my head I was like, why? Why do you need any change detection? Because observables are reactive primitives. You get to have an event and have a data stream go all the way down with declarative async code all the way down until the features, and then what's left to do? You just have to subscribe and actually manipulate the DOM. So I thought this was kind of the end goal of Angular. And Rob Wormold did say that the future of Angular was zoneless and heavy RxJS. So that was really exciting to me because I've been trying to convince people of the benefits of thinking reactively, not just for performance, but I thought if Angular actually allowed us to take advantage of the performance potential of RxJS, that would be a huge motivation for Angular apps to all just go full reactive. And as a side effect of that, we'd have no race conditions or inconsistent state, all these benefits that I mentioned. Better code organization, simpler state management, all these things that you don't get if you have a mixture of imperative and reactive code because of the manual subscriptions and subscription management and all these chaotic things. So, yeah, a lot of developers still don't even know what it's really like to have a declarative app. And I was, I've always been a bit sad because of that about Angular, because I thought if only it could really embrace RxJS and use its reactivity to give better and better performance, then developers could at least try out. They'd have more motivation to try out full reactivity, and then they would eventually get used to it. And, thinking reactively is new for everybody. In 2016, 2017, it was new for everybody. I didn't know anything about it until I really, really dived into it. So I was hoping that this would be a good opportunity for more and more people to jump on board with functional reactive programming. But this seemed like a really, really far away future because, Angular team kept talking about Ivy and how all these wonderful things would happen after Ivy came out, which it finally started to come out, I think in 2019. That was like the beta. I don't remember. The point is, in the meantime, I've had to deal with a lot of NgRx and Angular API problems because I shifted my mindset to reactivity, and now I actually see where NgRx isn't reactive enough. Here's an example of that. And so NgRx introduces you to reactivity, but it doesn't do enough. So with RxJS, if you didn't have any NgRx, if you're just doing pure reactivity with RxJS, you could, and let's say you had like 3 data sources, like a waterfall, they had to be requested in a series because you need this response from one to get to the other. Maybe one of these is a Firebase endpoint or something like that. I don't know. So you could just say, this is the first data, this is the second data, and it just happens to be defined as using the first data, but it is declared on its own as its own thing and emits values over time. So you could change it to be a WebSocket or whatever. It doesn't matter. It is completely declarative on its own. And then the third endpoint, same thing. So this is extremely flexible. You can define this anywhere you want. Anything that wants the first data, it gets it. And you don't need to, I just realized I used fetch instead of get here. Whatever. I used that 3 times. That's so weird. Anyway, so yeah, it doesn't matter. You can use it in many features, and if all of the features unsubscribe, if you navigate away, it'll clean up the subscriptions, cancel the HTTP request. It's efficient. It's just awesome. But how do you do this in NgRx? Actually, the recommended way to do this in NgRx is to use NgRx effects mostly. And so instead of subscribing to data, you dispatch an action saying, hey, I'm going to want that data, which is a really weird thing. And then later you subscribe to the store. So like the store is like this weird, inconvenient indirection that you now have to deal with. Instead of just talking directly to the endpoint and using RxJS in a natural reactive data flow, you have to first get the data to the store, and then you have that relationship with the store. But then if you have like 2 components and one of them, and both of them need the same data, but one of them actually dispatch the action to trigger the data to get from the server to the store, the second one would be able to just get it from the store, which actually puts an implicit dependency between those 2 features. Because if the first one then gets taken away, it's not dispatching that action anymore. And so the second feature will just sit there and not ever trigger the data to get into the store. So anyway, this is kind of like advanced concerns. Most of the time, people are okay with dealing with all this annoyance. But in the case where you have two requests in series and you want to handle the cancellation efficiently through NgRx effects. I'm sorry, this is the best image I have for this. What happened? My mouse battery died. Oh, that sucks. All right. This. Yeah. This is as good as it's going to get. I zoom in, you won't be able to read anything anyway. So what's on the left is how you do this like waterfall type request and cancellation with NgRx effects, at least in 2017. And on the right is RxJS in 2017 as well. Much simpler, much more flexible with NgRx effects. This gets more complex for each subsequent request you need. And so most people aren't going to, they're just not going to handle this. They're just going to, do it sort of inefficiently and imperatively, basically. It's going to be imperative. So, yeah. NgRx isn't fully reactive. So it took a while to adopt a reactive mindset. And so the alternatives to NgRx that were more imperative, they arrived first, NgXS, Akita. But then the more reactive ones, RxAngular was the first one probably that was really reactive. NgRx Component Store is a little reactive too. It's not emphasized in the examples, but it can be reactive. And then, the library I created, StateAdapt. That one is also just designed to be as reactive as possible, as reactive as you can be in Angular. So RxJS was introduced heavier and heavier into Angular developers' workflow. And then some people hated it, other people loved it, ran with it, and then kind of outgrew NgRx, but also Angular. Angular has a lot of limitations with RxJS. It was pretty obvious from the beginning that RxJS wasn't really designed thoroughly. Angular wasn't designed thoroughly to be used with RxJS. It's, there have been issues from the very beginning, a lot of them. So I think at the beginning, the Angular team, I think I've heard somebody say this even, that the Angular team thought that RxJS was a good way to represent event streams, but that was about it. And so that's basically the mindset that all Angular developers had back in 2016. They're like promises, but a little better because they can return multiple values. So that's like an event stream. So cool. But then they also used it for route params, because then you could have the route param update, and then inside the component, you can react to that instead of re-rendering the entire route. So that was interesting because it's like state instead of an event. So that's kind of like an exception, but it was a really good use case. But, all these RxJS use cases are great. But anyway, they didn't use them for component inputs. And that was one of the most demanded features in Angular, was to be able to describe Angular or inputs, component inputs, as observables, because they are values that change over time, just like route parameters. So why not component inputs? So I remember in a job interview in 2017, Aaron Frost was interviewing me to work at SaltStack, and he asked me what I thought or what I liked about Angular, and then he asked me what I didn't like. And this was 2017, around September, and I told him that I wish component inputs were observables. And yeah, that's been at the top of my list ever since I learned Angular and then RxJS more and more. So yeah, it's always been awkward to use RxJS with Angular. And so I actually empathize with developers who have negative feelings towards RxJS. I just think they're a little mistaken, because I don't think they realize how easy it could be to use RxJS in Angular if it had better support, because Svelte is a good example. Let's say you need to subscribe to an observable, and just as a simple, in the component class, not the template itself, but the class. With Angular, you have to subscribe, obviously, and you have to set the data somewhere imperatively, and then you have to have an ng on destroy that's going to clean up that subscription when the component is destroyed. That's like 4 lines of code. In Svelte, you just put a $sign in front of it, and then that's a variable assignment, and now that variable becomes the output of that observable, and it cleans up the subscription automatically. So why can't it be like that in Angular? It'd be so nice. And so all these Angular developers that are complaining all the time about RxJS and they just wish it was never introduced to Angular. I just think I wish I could have them try some Svelte and see if they still hate RxJS. And I bet that many of them wouldn't, because yes, RxJS actually does suck to use in Angular, but it doesn't have to. So anyway, I could go into a lot more detail, but I'm not going to. I've done that before in other places, and anyway. So all right, so there was an issue, a specific GitHub issue. I'm going to show you here. Hang on. Oh, my mouse died. I forgot. Check it out. December 7th, 2015. Hey, happy anniversary for this depressing piece of Angular history. Oh man, I wanted this so bad for so long. Okay, yeah, input is observable. So many comments, almost 300 comments by the time it was closed. At one point, I remember Rob Wormold saying, after Ivy is out, we'll have an opportunity to look at a bunch of issues like this. And then Ivy came out, and nothing. Nobody said anything. We finally got somebody to respond to the issue. I created an open source library for this. I tried to... Like 5 people created open source libraries for this, but decorators suck. Decorators suck. Type safety is... Anyway, so you need to have access to basically Angular's core to really solve this in a way where the syntax doesn't suck. So also there was a bug with my implementation because tree shaking with lifecycle hooks, some obscure thing. Anyway, so basically this needed to be solved by the Angular team. Everybody had workarounds and the workarounds sucked. So but anyway, so one of the Angular team members finally commented. I think she was a team member. She must have been. She had the authority to... I think she had the authority. Anyway, so we got this comment saying, turning inputs into observables would more tightly couple Angular with RxJS, and we don't want to further couple with RxJS. Wait, what? It's you're the reason we learned this. Like, why aren't you? And then the last comment before the issue was closed was by Minko Getchev, who is kind of in charge of Angular now. And this was within the last year. I don't remember exactly when. The first thing he mentioned was the community split over RxJS. So we will share our plans for more ergonomic RxJS APIs when we prioritize that project. That's the last thing he said. So basically, it seems like they think that... So Angular for a long time has suffered with developer satisfaction. And a lot of it was the jump from Angular 1 to 2. But then I think RxJS is behind a lot of it. Not for the reason they think. I think RxJS integration is the problem. That people think RxJS sucks because RxJS in Angular sucks. And so when he says, when he cites, the split in the community, as well as RxJS being kind of overrepresented in people who are passionate about Angular and involved in the community, the Angular team, as far as I can tell, they believe that Angular would be a more popular framework if it weren't for RxJS. I actually wonder if some of them think of that as the number one reason. Makes me sad. So I made this meme to represent how I felt about this. This is the Angular team talking to RxJS fans. You turn them against me. You have done that yourself. Basically, it's not RxJS's fault. It's Angular, because if you look at how Angular deals with everything, it's not just RxJS. There is boilerplate all over in Angular. There's a lot of boilerplate. Standalone components are a great improvement, but still, you can create a new component in React with one line, a single line of code. So until we get to that point, which we probably never will. We don't need to, but in Angular. But anyway, I think it's a scapegoat. I don't think it's realistic to blame any problems Angular has on RxJS. Any problems. Because RxJS is a good tool. It's a great tool, and it's easy to use in Svelte. So, yeah. So at this point, I was like, okay, what are they doing? What are they going to do? Because we have RxJS, what are they going to come up with? How are they going to decouple from RxJS, but still increase the ergonomics of using RxJS? It didn't make sense to me. But then I saw a member of the Angular team tweeting about this. I'll show you the tweet. Here it is. Paweł Kozlowski. I hope I said that right. So yeah, he's just playing with different syntaxes for reactive primitives. I was like, whoa, like a different reactive primitive? Is Angular about to become like Vue with like all these different modes of using it? We're going to have like people who like RxJS over here, and then this new alternative reactive primitive over here. And I was like, there's no way they are thinking reactively with this, because this was only for synchronous state. This is for synchronizing state. So it's synchronous reactivity, not functional reactive programming. So it's going to miss so much value from RxJS. So not only am I not going to have that future, that beautiful picture painted by, at least in my imagination, by Rob Wormold of no change detection, just pure functional reactive programming, clean declarative async code, just that wonderful future. Not only that we're not going to have that, but a bunch of, all the Angular developers who haven't given, reactive programming a try are going to use this instead. And I'm not sure they're ever really going to try RxJS again, because some of them, Angular, so we start like this. Angular forces you to learn RxJS. Angular doesn't support RxJS very well. People start to hate the experience of RxJS in Angular. And then Angular comes up with this new reactive primitive that's simpler but far less capable and can't do any of the cool things RxJS can do. People go to that. They never look at RxJS again. That, I really hope that doesn't happen. I don't think it has to happen, but I really hope it doesn't. So this was when I was the most bothered by Angular at this point, just like within the last 6 to 9 months, whatever. But I've been watching Ryan Carniato's streams, and I saw him as kind of the source of this new direction. Not really, because the Angular team has been looking at other frameworks. I've talked about this before, but they sort of have been exploring reactive primitives for a while now. But Ryan Carniato and SolidJS just got way more popular suddenly. And Ryan Carniato actually got invited by the Angular team to present on Signals. So I'm like, okay, well, at least they're asking, a really cool, smart person about it. That's cool, because Ryan Carniato is really smart. And so I'm like, okay, at least they're doing it right if they're going to do it. They're really researching it. They're going to make the best, limited it may be, but it will be the best limited reactive primitive that we could have, probably. So that made me a little happy. But it became my goal to convince Ryan Carniato and everybody I could that without asynchronous reactivity, you're not programming reactively. State synchronization is easy. That's just the map operator from RxJS. So what you really need is the other operators. And so you can have actual reactive code. And yeah, so, but I kept watching his streams, and I commented. I was really annoying on his streams. I would comment all the time and just say, hey, RxJS. And he kept addressing it, and he thought he addressed it enough, but he didn't. So I kept commenting more and more and trying to get him to say that RxJS is fine-grained reactivity, because he has this distinction between Fine-grained reactivity, that's his signal mechanism, and stuff like it, Preact signals, and other stuff. And then RxJS observables, which are not fine-grained according to him. And so I finally got a conversation, basically, like 4 or 5 comments on YouTube back and forth about why he calls RxJS not fine-grained. Why he thinks fine-grained is a good way to distinguish them, because you can do fine-grained updates with RxJS. It literally is fine-grained. Like an observable of something, that's its own internal change detection. It doesn't require you to update anything else. It's internally reactive. So that's fine-grained. And then I don't know how clear he was in this, but what he said reminded me of a lot of stuff I already knew. And he basically said something about sharing values, pulling values, like repeating values and combining. He says he doesn't call it fine-grained reactivity because while you can do fine-grained reactivity with RxJS, and he did in a previous version of Solid, people tend not to, because it's so annoying to deal with synchronizing state when you're using RxJS's model for reactivity. And so when he said some of those words, it kind of connected something in my mind. And so I have to give a little bit of background on RxJS. When I first learned NgRx, I wanted to use RxJS for everything. I thought this was so cool. This observable lets you this library lets you take an observable of any data and then chain off of it and create derived data of either synchronous with a map operator or asynchronous. Any relationship you want, RxJS covers all of it. I thought it was so cool. So I implemented all of my selectors like this. So store.select, select items. This was actually a string at first, but same thing. And then, combine latest, and then there are .maps, combine latest, .map, combine latest, and .map is how we used to do operators. Maps and combine latest, a lot of them. And I was pretty happy with that. But then my team lead at the time, he was noticing a little bit of jitter with the rendering of the app. It would lock a little bit. So he put some console logs in some places, and he found that one of the lists at some point was being filtered 28 times. He put a console log and it logged 28 times. So on the initial page load, this list was being filtered 28 times. I was like, no, there's something wrong here. I can't believe this. Because I actually stuck my neck out a little bit on that project. I had been a little ambitious. I did a really, really ambitious project. I actually worked 100 hours that week. That's the only time I've ever worked that much. And it's because I really wanted to use new Angular. And they weren't going to let us. And so I had to, in order to save my own career. As soon as their decision was final, I said, all right, I'm going to use my own time. I'm going to upgrade this project to Angular. I don't want to touch AngularJS ever again. And I actually didn't really after that until I started doing upgrades for Hero Devs. Anyway, so I did that. And so I was like, this is great, guys. Trust me, this is going to be awesome. And then he puts a console log in there and he's like, it's logging 28 times. I'm like, no. All right, let's see what's happening. Why is this happening? And then I got to learn about RxJS a lot more. It turns out that RxJS thinks everything is an event. And so if you have 2 observables, one is an observable of the number 1, and then the second one doubles it. If you push a 1 into the first one again, the second one will calculate the double again, even though it already did it for the number 1 before. And so there's an operator for that. You have to call distinct until changed. That keeps it from redoing the same values. It memoizes basically the input. So I was like, oh, great, this is it. I put it in, still lots of console logs. I'm like, okay, all right, I got to learn some more. And so the next thing I tried was, the next thing I learned about was sharing. I noticed that the number of reruns changed if I commented out a downstream observable. So I realized, every time you chain off of one of these upper observables, it causes that upper observable, like everything from the very top, all the values trickle through all the same pipes once for every single subscriber at the end of the chain. So I was like, oh my gosh, why would it do this? There has to be a workaround. So I discovered something called share replay. It didn't exactly do what I wanted. There's some weird thing where it never cleans up subscriptions. Or it never ends. And so you have to do publish replay and then ref count. And then if that has no subscribers, then unsubscribes from above. Okay, so I'm like, okay, that other developers aren't going to like this. I have to tell them that every time they combine observables, every time an observable is reused, which would be like almost always, this kind of breaks that declarative thing I was talking about. Why should you change a thing because something else needs it? That's not self-contained. That's not declarative. So I'm like, okay, this sucks. All right. Well, this is just how it has to be. And then I discovered another problem. And this one was with combined latest. And this one's actually called the diamond problem. So when you have a combined latest like this, and you have an event that changes both items and filters, how many times is the combined latest going to run? Twice. Once for the new value of items and the old value of filters, and then again once it gets the new value of filters. So not only is it running too many times, you have to deal with these weird intermediate states that shouldn't even exist. So this sucks even more. And you know what? There is a workaround for this. The first one I figured out was debounce time. Because, if you just wait, then it will... How did I even do this? I don't remember. This is barely a workaround, but if you put a debounce time at the end of this, after this, and then do a map after that for this, that's what the workaround was. So this function doesn't have to run because the debounce time waits for all of the synchronous changes to end. But the problem with that in Angular is that triggers another change detection run. So that sucks. That sucks. So I honestly, I love RxJS. I loved it so much that I spent basically a whole day just thinking about this problem, banging my head against the wall. How do we get combined latest to not do anything until the new observables values come through? And I knew it had something to do with schedulers, and Michael Ladke figured it out because he's a genius. So go check out RxAngular for that solution. But it's still not great in my opinion because of the syntax, just the syntax. And that's only one of the three problems that I had. And you can create custom operators for the other things, like maybe a custom select operator that automatically applies distinct until changed. But think about like the overhead. That can't just be syntactic overhead. These custom operators you're using require a lot of work under the hood. So if you actually came across a feature that required a lot of real-time updates all the time, it was very, 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 very high performance requirements. Is this really the way you want to do this? RxJS starts to seem heavy at this point. And so unfortunately, I was like, you know what? This isn't worth it anymore because I was avoiding this the whole time. Just selectors. This is why NgRx uses selectors instead of observables. This was like a big problem that a bunch of people all at the same time ran across. I don't remember if NgRx had these from the beginning. I don't think they did, actually. I think I remember reading an article where they said, look at these selectors. This is a new thing in NgRx, but it was a very early version. And so they talked about the diamond problem, basically. And they didn't call it that. It was more like hey, combine latest will limit once for every single time. Yeah, so this wasn't, I didn't like this syntax. I don't like selector syntax. It's very verbose. You got select at the beginning of all of them and create a selector, all the inputs. It's basically the same as RxJS, but a little worse. Instead of a $sign at the end, you just have select and it's 2 words. So yeah, I didn't like that. But I realized, that's what we have to do. To really have good, efficient selectors, we need derived state, we need selectors. To have good derived state, we need selectors. So I was kind of defeated. I wanted to use RxJS so bad, but it just makes sense to use selectors instead. They're just something that you can count on. They scale to any level of performance requirements, as far as anything really, compared to any other alternative. So that's just something I look for now. When I look at state management libraries, I check how they handle selectors. Is it just observables with RxJS? If it is, do they tell their users that you're going to have code that runs a lot of times unless you share everything and distinct until change and all these things? And most of them that depend on RxJS instead of a central store, they don't give tools to developers to handle derived state very well. And how could you? They're independent behavior subjects. At the point where you solve the diamond problem, it has to be at the top, where a change happens first. It has to be able to, you have to be able to have that one change be lazily accessed by the thing that recombines derived states. So, yeah. So, RxAngular is like the only one that depends heavily on RxJS and actually gives you something to do about it, but I'm not sure what it does with shared state. These problems aren't impossible to work around. It's just not as, it can't be as performant and clean as something that where you don't have to, something that wasn't built as it and built to treat everything as if it's a new event. So selectors, selectors are good. Right. So I never really liked the syntax of selectors. So when I created state adapt, I created my own type of syntax where I use a proxy object to detect the input selectors. So instead of create a selector with this and this, you should just be able to use those things. And then your system is like, oh, they need this state. That's how you want to write code. Like putting this dependency list up front sucks. It really sucks. And this, actually, RxJS has this problem too. So anyway, basically since 2017, it's been RxJS selectors, RxJS for asynchronous stuff, and then to wrap selectors so that you can use the async pipe with the observable, but then the selectors kind of do all that synchronous derived state logic. But then I watched another Ryan Carniato stream where he talked about Marco. And Marco is a weird library. It's like extreme Angular. It's very, very template driven, very unique syntax, but it's so many weird things, but it's unique. But the main thing with it is colocation. And so you can have everything end to end, data fetching, everything inside of HTML, inside localized. And so you can move things around easily. It's just really flexible and cool. So I've been thinking about colocation a lot. Like when do we co-locate things? And when should things be separate? And so I've always thought of 3 types of selectors. One is state selectors. These are very simple. They just select from the state object, and it allows you to decouple the state shape from the consumers. But anyway, you export them with the reducer, basically. Basically, where you define the state shape, that's where these selectors belong. And then derived state. This can be like selectors, or let's see, derived selectors. This can be selectors that do a lot of heavy calculation. There can be like a lot of business logic where you get items and you apply the filters and you got weird filter logic, or you combine state from multiple stores. anything, from between the very simple state selectors down to the very bottom. And that third type of selector at the very bottom, I call UI selectors, because they, Angular templates are ugly, and doing a lot of logic inside templates or components is generally frowned upon. And so, and the template language is limited too. So pretty frequently you have your world of abstract data that's where everything is efficient, everything is clean and easy to understand, and then you have like the real world ugly HTML UI where the designers gave you some weird way to represent data, and you have to take what you wish you had, some nice clean interfaces of data, and hook it up to this weird UI. And so I called these UI selectors that kind of layer after the derived selectors, where you could just separate it. So you could do your logic, your derived logic, however you wanted. And then at the very end, you could basically adapt it for the UI. So yeah, that kept logic out of the templates, and it put more logic into pure functions, which is always great because pure functions are easy to test. And so I thought this is perfect for selectors. But then I have recently been thinking about colocation. One example that I use in this article that goes with this video, I'll have a link in the description, is if you have a rectangle and its position in the data is determined as X 50, Y 200, something like that. But then in the CSS, you actually have to style it left 50 pixels, top 200 pixels. So a UI selector would be great for that, because you could just take the X and Y, and right where the component needs it, right at the end of the selectors, the very last selector will just transform it into a CSS style. So yeah, that'd be nice. But the more I did this, the more awkward it felt, because I've got this weird, I could kind of tell what everything was used for, all the selectors. This obviously filters things. This is combining that. This is providing a default value from these two different things. So they're pretty self-descriptive until the UI selectors. The UI selectors had names that were specific to components, almost as if they were referencing those components directly, like they wish they could, because what they were doing depended on those components. It seemed like the selectors were looking up at the state and down at the components. And so it felt like a weird concern. And so I had to revisit the whole idea of UI selectors. I honestly think that they should be close to the template. It feels like a better separation of concerns that way. Because yes, they are pure functions, but you can put that logic in a way in the component where it still can be tested easily. And the main thing to ask whether things are separate concerns or not is how often are they changed together? And the thing with UI selectors is every time the UI changes, they need to change. And so it kind of makes sense to put them in components. It kind of is equal, it makes equal sense to put them in a component or in the selectors file. But it felt more right for me, recently it has, to put them in the component, because one example is the docs adapter that I wrote for the StateAdapt docs, where it has this UI component for selecting options. It's like mat option. I don't remember what it actually is, but or mat select. I don't even remember what the material one was. But the selector was basically importing from Angular material, which is like a component library, right? But right there in the selectors file, it just felt weird to have these almost like UI components, component interfaces that are used in components, determined right there in the end. And then, the component already has to be aware of derived selectors and other things. So it, to me, it makes more sense to use it with the component. I don't know if I did. I probably did a terrible job of explaining that, but I have a feeling most of you are going to agree with that, because when I've tried to pitch the idea of UI selectors to team members in the past that I've been on, teams I've been on, I never really got a response that was like, that's a great idea. It's always like, okay. Because, the component was the reason that it existed. So why couldn't it just be in the component? It's not really business logic at that point. It is a UI concern. So I don't know. Hopefully I did an okay job of explaining that. Anyway, but there's a problem with this though. How do you define selectors in a component? Memoize selectors. I did this in a couple places. Let me see. I might be skipping ahead in the article, but anyway, so here's RxJS. Like I was saying, distinctive change, publish, replay, ref count. I actually think there's a new way of doing this with RxJS, but I don't care. Basically, you got to do all this stuff, the map, and anyway. And then let's see, where is my state adapt? That's SolidJS. Okay, I don't know where my examples went. Hang on. Here's state adapt. Yeah. So, this is fine. It's more minimal than NgRx would have been. Here's NgRx. Create a selector right here inside the component. You're really going to do this? A selector is the thing that makes sense to use here. But you would want this logic to be here in the component. But a selector itself is a little annoying for this. Anyway, so just keep that in your mind, that there is this issue with selectors where in order to co-locate the logic, like the UI logic inside the UI itself, and to have it be efficient and to use selectors, it has to use kind of a slightly weird syntax. Anyway, so the syntax could be improved. But there's actually another issue, and that is component inputs. Remember how I really wanted observables? I wanted to represent component inputs as observables. Well, there was one comment on that issue, that Angular issue that was open since December 2015. One comment brought up an issue with having them be represented as observables. It's actually the diamond problem again. Here's an article I linked to. It's about a new reactive library that's cool. Anyway, it talks about the diamond problem, where you can have an update to a central piece of state, and then that has two derived states, and then when you recombine them, you don't want this to run twice, this combination logic. So that's the diamond problem. Component inputs are the diamond problem, because you can have one state change, let's say it's user, and then you have a user component, and it takes name and email as separate inputs. If you would represent those as observables suck at this. They will emit one at a time. And so if you have a combined latest where you need to combine name and email for some reason, or whatever the two inputs are, you'll get the combined latest firing for each of them. So same exact problem as before. Okay? And that's local to the component. And selectors can't solve that problem. So how are we going to solve that problem? We want reactivity here. RxJS won't work. Selectors won't work. RxJS can work, but like I talked about before, it's not ideal. And selectors as well. The syntax I don't love. And, you can't really use selectors for component inputs. I thought a little bit down that road, but that's irrelevant. I don't think you can. But actually, it's not really a problem, because there is a way to handle all these problems in a really nice way, and that is with a different reactive primitive. So you can have one for events and one for state. So that's what signals are. Signals are a good reactive primitive for synchronizing state. RxJS is good for events. This is good for synchronizing state. So here's what a SolidJS component looks like. It's like React, but you have create signal instead of create state. Other than that, it's pretty similar. And also this is not an actual state. It's a getter. And so you call it. So this is derived state. This is really simple. The same thing with Angular and RxJS right here. This is Angular. This is SolidJS. They do the same thing. Exact same thing. Okay. Right. So here are the reasons SolidJS is better. And these are different ways of saying what's wrong with RxJS. You don't need to worry about, well, actually, here's something I didn't talk about. With Angular, you can have state as a variable, a class property, or an observable. And you don't know which one to use until you have to implement some derived state. Okay. And so then you're like, oh, this suddenly needs to be an observable. Have you ever done that? Have you ever started something as not observable and then later had to change it to an observable? I have. So, but with SolidJS and with signals, everything that's state is a signal. And so you don't even have to worry about that. It's just not even a question you ask. It's just really easy. So, anyway, and recomputing, you don't need to have distinct until changed. Out of the box, signals are not going to recompute when they receive the same value. Same thing with shared. If multiple things are using the same state, it's not going to recompute for each of them, unlike RxJS. And with combining, you don't have that diamond problem. By default, out of the box, it just recomputes once for the one thing. So, this isn't really competing against RxJS. Do you really want to use the RxJS map operator? It's not a big deal to use a signal. For the benefits that come with it, out of the box, the performance benefits, without all the extra syntax and without all the stress of trying to plan ahead and trying to change things and have that friction as you're trying to think of a new design of, I'll have to go change that to an observable. You don't have to deal with any of that. You don't have to deal with any of that. You can just use the signal and then you're good. It's perfect for derived states. So I compare it with RxJS. Here are selectors. Selectors are fine, but again, how do you deal with component inputs? And selectors here with NgRx, it's even worse than state-adapt. But state-adapt isn't too bad. This is pretty small, but the smallest. Look at this. Oh man, that's amazing. Anyway, so basically, selectors are good at being efficient, but the syntax isn't wonderful. And how do you deal with component inputs? And so it would be nice if Angular had a reactive primitive. It would be. So there, I changed my mind. Angular needs a reactive primitive. Here's what I think would be great. Let's just call it signal. I don't care if it's create signal. Nobody cares. Signal is a verb too. So signal is shorter, simpler. I like it. And then memo. No use memo, no create memo. Just do memo. Everyone knows what it's for. And then each will have a get method and a set method. And then what we want is RxJS, of course, because and this could be component inputs. How nice would this be? You can just define a derived state by or with this syntax. It's just like RxJS. You get the same reactive benefit, but it's going to be efficient out of the box. That would be nice. So obviously RxJS is still necessary. It's necessary for asynchronous reactivity. And so, event stuff. So being able to convert between signals in RxJS is actually really important. So what I think would be cool is if there's this other property on signals, it's just $, and then it could lazy load RxJS dependencies because it's asynchronous anyway. Because that was one of the things that the Angular team wanted to do is try to eliminate RxJS from the core path of developing, from the Hello World Angular app. They wanted to eliminate RxJS from that. So what you could do is you could have signals still, but lazy load the RxJS extension, or you could just do it the way that Solid does it. With Solid, it has this observable function. You can pass in a signal, and then the return of observable can be passed into RxJS's from, because this is like subscriber observable whatever. So this becomes an observable. All right, that's pretty cool. And you can also convert from an observable to a signal. This would be awesome. So there you go. I have a lot of strong opinions, but I change them a lot when I learn new things. It's not like I'm moving from thing to thing. It's that I'm building from one thing to the next. And, I've learned all these things through a lot of pain and experience, and I'm open. Of course, I'm open-minded because all I really want is nice syntax and performant code, and not to have to stress about what I'm doing all the time, which kind of goes into nice syntax. Anyway, so to recap, RxJS, I just thought they were promises, but a little better. And then I started to learn about thinking reactively and all the benefits that come from functional reactive programming, which are incredible. And then I started to notice limitations in Angular and NgRx, and I wanted to have more reactivity than they allowed. And so I've been frustrated with Angular since then. But then I encountered Ryan Carniato stuff and signals, and so I realized that RxJS isn't great for synchronous state, actually. That selectors were what I used for that primarily, but actually signals are even better because they can be co-located inside the component, handle component inputs, and you don't need a global store for them. And so they kind of are just a better, on the ground synchronization primitive for Angular components. It really makes more sense now that I'm kind of thinking of it this way. So RxJS is necessary for asynchronous reactivity. You can build asynchronous reactivity on top of solid signals, but nothing is as comprehensive and nice as RxJS. If you want to increase the likelihood that you can write something declarative with async code, having a library of already written functions for handling all the asynchronous situations that can come up will maximize, it'll make it as easy as possible to actually write declarative async code instead of coming up with some ad hoc imperative stuff. So asynchronous, good for or RxJS, good for asynchronous reactivity. Selectors are good for, they still have a place because they're good for reusable state management patterns. So state adapters are probably still they're forever going to have selectors because state change functions and selectors from state, state selectors and derived selectors. Those two belong with state, and that makes more sense to have as selectors. So selectors are good for that. But then a simple reactive primitive for simple local reactive state synchronization at the component level in Angular. That's what I see, and so that's a lot. So what I first see is a regular Angular component, and then you introduce signals, so synchronous derived state, and then you start to need some declarative state management patterns, and so you would create state adapters, just ways to handle state in a declarative way with centralized state change functions, and then selectors can be part of that. And then RxJS to handle every asynchronous thing that happens before state is set. So I'm going to keep working on this. I'm going to keep thinking about this. This is a long video. I'm getting tired. I'm going to keep improving state adapt, and I'm going to create an implementation for SolidJS. I think this will help me know how to deal with Angular's new reactive primitive. So yeah, plus SolidJS is amazing. You should try it out. Anyway, so I don't know exactly how things are going to evolve in the future, but it's just interesting that over this time I've had so many strong opinions, and I just love that I'm right, but also somebody else has a point. And the funny thing is, I already agreed with them and didn't realize it because of my struggles with RxJS early on and realizing that selectors were needed for simpler state management. So that is interesting. So all of us have different pieces of the puzzle, and we're all trying to move forward and make web development suck less and make us more productive and happier as we develop web apps. Because it'd be nice to have a framework that we don't feel like we're constantly fighting. So, yeah, I'm really optimistic about the future, and I think that this reactive primitive and, this idea of signals, they're kind of invading all the frameworks. It's, well, a lot of them. It's a good thing for web development. So I'm really excited about where things are going. All right. That's all I have to say in this video. So thanks for watching. I really want to hear your own experiences. If you struggled the same way I have with a lot of these same issues, and a lot of you, I see there's no way to make a video about web development without React developers coming out of the woodwork and saying something. But if React developers haven't come to terms with the value of RxJS yet, they will. And it might be in the form of React Query, which I recently learned has its own internal implementation of something like RxJS, or whatever. But declarative code is the future. It's simpler. It's more maintainable. It can be more performant. Well, that's not really true. The point is, it's more declarative, more maintainable. You can be more productive, and your code bases can be simpler. So, all right, that's it. Thanks for watching.